Okay. So, good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us for tonight's presentation, We Are All Whalers. I'm Mike Cronin. I'm a board member at the Marion Natural History Museum. Before we get started, I'd like to make a plug for our website, where you can see any of our upcoming after-school and community programs. The website's also where you can make a donation to the museum. Most of our programs are powered by donations from the community, so please consider making a donation. If you have any questions during tonight's presentation, we'd like you to submit them via the chat function here in Zoom. We'll field them to Michael either during the presentation or at the end. So I'd like to introduce our speaker for this evening, Michael Moore. Michael is currently a senior scientist at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, where he's been since 1986. He is director of the Hui Marine Mammal Center and provides veterinary support to the Marine Mammal Rescue and Research Division of the International Fund for Animal Welfare, supporting their work with stranded marine mammals on Cape Cod. Michael's latest book, We Are All Whalers, The Plight of Whales and Our Responsibility, is being released for sale this coming week. Proceeds from the sale of the book go to whale conservation. Michael lives on Ram Island in Marion, where he maintains 4 osprey poles. And if you have any children in Marion, he is best known for being the husband of Mrs. Moore, the Sippacan School band teacher. And with that, I'll pass this off to Michael.
Well, thank you, Mike, and thank you for the invitation to present to the Natural History Museum and you all, and thanks for coming. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show a few slides, mostly from the book, illustrations, and talk about, the basis for the book and why I wrote it and what I hope to get folks will get from it. And I've picked out some readings to add to that. Obviously, traditionally with a book reading and a signing, I sign the copies of the books if you have them. But in lieu of that, what I have is a sticky backed book plate, which I can sign and send to you. So just email me or get a hold of me one way or another, and send me a mailing address, and I can send you a signed bookplate if you bought the book. It is available now. They've been selling it from the University of Chicago Press for the last few weeks, but they've run out. However, there are some on the shelf at the New Bedford Whaling Museum currently. I'm not sure how many they've got now, but anyway, you can get them there too. So on the left there is the cover of the book, and it's the illustration is of a whale lying on its back, a right whale, and this is this eyeball right here looking at you saying, "What you guys doing? Why are we in trouble?" And this white patch here is a callosity. It's a crusty piece of skin with some lice on it. And if you flip it over and look at the whale right side up, the eyeball is right there. And the other pieces of this picture that I think will be valuable for you are more of the thickened skin patches covered in lice, which we call callosities, and we'll talk about that a bit more in a couple of slides. But this here is the lower lip, and this is the baleen. It's a rack of baleen, the plates of horny fingernail-like material that create the filter that, as the animal swims through the water, all the bugs in the water that it feeds on goes right through here. This is the flipper, and this is the tail here that allows everything to get pushed along through the water. So that's the basis of the anatomy of the right whale. I say the right whale, there are actually 3 species. So the black here is the North Atlantic right whale species, and the gray is the North Pacific right whale, and this is the southern right whale, which are actually doing very well these days. All of these species were heavily knocked down to a few hundred animals by whaling. The North Atlantic right whale was essentially commercially extinct by 1700. It used to be on both sides of the North Atlantic, Iceland up through Norway and down to Spain. And actually they would breed also off the Western Sahara down here. So the North Atlantic right whale has suffered really from 1,000 years of whaling. They were taxing right whale baleen in the Basque Country 1,000 years ago, but also more recently, fishing and shipping industries have taken their toll on the animal as well. And perhaps I should just explain my thinking behind the title, We Are All Whalers. Whaling as a term is to catch or entrap a whale. There's no really expression of intent, at least if you go to the Oxford English Dictionary, that's what I could find, was it's just catching or trapping a whale. So whether you mean to or not, if you mean to with a harpoon, so be it. But if you set a net or hit a whale with a ship, you're also essentially whaling. So the thesis I'm going to try and persuade you to view, in my view, is that there are accidental and intentional ways of killing whales. And whether we want to buy whale meat or whether we want to buy the produce that comes from those accidental activities, such as buying goods from Walmart because of the cargo ship that came from China, hit the right whale and killed it. So you, by buying that material, are essentially enabling that industry. If we didn't import anything from China, we wouldn't have container ships coming that way, or Korea or wherever. Likewise, you and I both like our lobster roll or our lobsters in the restaurant. If we didn't create that market, then the traps wouldn't be set and the rope that entangles these whales likewise wouldn't come. So that's my basis for the title. And I hope by the end of the book, end of the talk, you'll agree that I'm not totally crazy, but maybe I am. So another quick view of the anatomy here. So this is a aerial view of the drone of the head of a right whale. So this is this upper jaw here, and these are these callosities again. So we can use these to individually identify the whale, take photographs, and then compare them in the catalog we maintain at Newland Aquarium. And that allows us to track the history of where the animal was, what happened to it, how many calves it's had or not, and so on, and who it hangs out with. So this again is the baleen, and this is the lower lip you saw before, and this is the eyebrow callosity we saw again, and these are the blowholes. So now what I'm going to do is let you watch this video. I hope it's going to run straight without too much trouble with feed, but it's a little bit jerky. I'm sorry about that. Anyway, I'm going to read you the first piece out of the book now. So it's in the beginning of the preface. Recently, I spent an early April day in the southwestern corner of Cape Cod Bay in eastern Massachusetts in the United States with a friend. He had been at sea his entire working life, but had never knowingly been close to a right whale. His day job was master of an oil tanker on the Valdez, Alaska to San Francisco, California run, where he might have been close to a North Pacific right whale. He was vastly overqualified to skipper our boat, which he did while I piloted a small drone to measure the lengths and widths of the many feeding North Atlantic right whales we had found in a small area. There was no wind that day. The sea was like a mill pond. It was crisp, cold, sunny, and quiet. We shut down the motor, drifted, watched, and listened. As each animal surfaced, exhaled, and immediately inhaled, we listened to the unique cadence of their breaths, and we watched their steady progress through the water with their mouths wide open, filtering the clouds of food close to the surface. Periodically, they slowly closed on the boat, and we could see into their open mouths with small eddies of water peeling away from their lips. Much larger eddies formed in their wakes as their powerful tails and bodies pushed them along. They made tight turns using their huge flippers and tails as rudders to keep themselves within the food patches. This went on all day. As the sun started to sink behind the cliffs on the nearby western shore of Cape Cod Bay, their creamy white upper jaws, just visible above the surface, turned to a vibrant golden hue. It was a peaceful, majestic, timeless sight, and a huge privilege to be permitted to study these animals. So that's the end of that little piece of the preface. The preface actually really does preface the whole book, and you could read that and get a sense of where I was going with it. So after that, there's this map that essentially lays out the plot geographically. I talk about some time that I spent as an undergraduate in the Faroe Islands studying pilot whales. We'll talk in a little bit about the time I spent on a whaling ship in Iceland in 1983. Prior to that, I spent some time in Newfoundland and Labrador studying humpback whales and finback whales. And then obviously there's the right whales up in the eastern seaboard here, also up in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And then in the Gulf of Maine, the fisheries there that I've been involved with, obviously based in Woods Hole, but especially, and I'm not going to talk much about that tonight, but I spent some time in the North Slope of Alaska with the Inupiat artisanal whalers that take bowhead whales, and here you can see them taking the whale apart. I went up there to learn how they do that, but also to figure out how they managed to, despite the depredations of Yankee whalers from New Bedford, et cetera, in the 1800s, maintain the bowhead species for thousands of years, living with it in a reasonable harmony, albeit they're killing them and eating them. They're part of their culture, and they were able to not extirpate them, and they're still whaling a very small percentage of the animals and doing quite well. And we can talk about that, but I don't really dig deeper into that in the talk at this point. We can certainly chat about it afterwards. So, as I said, early on in my career, the first thing I did after I finished being a veterinary student in England was to spend some time in Iceland aboard one of these whaling ships. It's a classic commercial whaler. And my task was to figure out how efficient these explosive harpoons were at killing whales. It's kind of gruesome. And, why would I do that? Well, I was interested in whales and whaling, and they offered me a paycheck. So off I went. And what we found was that it was pretty efficient. These animals were dying in on average, less than 4 minutes. So that was an early data point in my scientific career. And what that led to was this question, which comes from the book at the beginning of one of the chapters. What is worse for a whale, an explosive harpoon or entanglement? One of the big surprises in my life is that the answer to this question is neither obvious nor clear-cut. So, and I'll elaborate on that and try and explain why I say that. But for now, we'll just leave it as that. So here we've got three different ways that whales die. We've got a whale on a whaling slip with a harpoon that was actually a very inefficient case in this case, because they didn't penetrate the chest really, and the animal didn't die at that time. They had to shoot it again. There's a right whale on the top right that's still alive, but you can probably see the blowholes has been sort of bisected by the forwardmost of those two ropes, and it's wrapped around a flipper. Here you can see the white patches here, which is actually a dead flipper. And then the rope went over the right-hand side of the whale into the mouth and then wrapped around the baleen on the left side. So it was in a pretty rough shape. And this is a right whale that was hit by a large cargo ship. And each of these slices is a cut from a rotating propeller. So it's like bread slicing as it goes along and around and around. So the idea that struck me was, as I started working at Hui to work with the federal government to look at these animals, figure out why they died, was the animals that were entangled in rope. These guys, this one took about 6 months to die. And as a veterinarian, that was shocking and striking and horrifying to me. And, then 4 minutes, 6 months. And these guys ranged from pretty much instantaneously, like it was for this one, because it had a massive pneumothorax when it sliced into the chest here. Two animals that die in hours, and occasionally they can die years later, but that's the exception. So vessel strikes are relatively quick. These are very quick, and these are really, really, really slow. So that was all background, really. But essentially, my time in Iceland became the sort of scientific control, my experimental control for my career, where I knew that humans could kill whales pretty efficiently. Then I stumbled and tripped over these guys, and this really was a shock to me that we were causing that amount of pain and suffering over multiple months for these animals. And so this contrast here was something that I had a really hard time with, and it's still today driving much of what I do and say and think. So a little bit more into how these animals get entangled, for which we need to understand a little bit about how lobster traps and crab traps are set in Canada, snow crabs. So there's a marker buoy at the surface, which is numbered usually, to enable the fisherman or fisherwoman who owns this gear to recognize that the gear is set on the bottom, know who it belonged to, and bring the traps up to the surface so they can be serviced to refresh the bait and take out the catch. And so this is called a trawl of traps, sometimes just a single trap, but here you've got a ground line along the bottom, and offshore they almost always use trawls with 20 or 40 traps going along. And they have an end line at the other end to pick it up as well. It used to be that these dotted lines where the ground lines were floating, they were discontinued, and now that they're all sinking ground lines. So the remaining entanglement threat is primarily in these two end lines here and in the surface gear as well. So, and obviously if this animal swims through here, it's going to get wrapped up in the end line, and that's the major remaining risk that we have. So just a little bit more about how these animals are affected by these entanglements. So this is one animal, it's the same animal, it's a little bit different in terms of the pattern of its head, but you can see that there's this big island here, and then there's two small islands here, and then there's a bit of a hook there, and the same shape there, and then these lip clusters. So it's the same animal. This is 10 months previous to this one. Shortly after this photograph was taken, it got entangled. You can see the rope coming out of the left side of the mouth and the right side of the mouth, and a long line that it's towing, and also wrapping around the right flipper as well. So both flippers are involved. So why? Okay, so the white line is the outline of the animal, how fat it was before it got entangled. The red line is about 2 weeks before it died, having become emaciated because of the drag of the rope. And there was potentially some traps as well on this animal, although they were gone by the time we got to examine it. But I don't know if you ever tried to pull a rope through the water when you're going along in a boat, but it can pull you in pretty easily because the drag on a rope is quite substantial. And we did some experimental work with rope and just towing it through the water to try and estimate what the drag cost, the energetic cost to the animal of dragging the rope through. And it's the equivalent of getting pregnant or of having a calf. And so not lactating, but certainly for gestating a calf, the equivalent energy cost can arise simply by being entangled chronically. And the longer you're entangled, obviously, the worse it gets. So with that, I'm now going to switch gears a little bit to an animal number 2301, which is actually the same animal that I was showing you just earlier. And this is the montage of 4 photographs at different times. And so this is when it was a calf. So this is 2301 as a calf. Here it is a juvenile. Here it is an unentangled adult. And then it's got the entanglement here. Okay. So I'm going to let you look at those photographs while I read you one of the 2 postscripts in the back of the book. These postscripts are my voice inside the head of a whale. And they really represent the conflict that I feel between the objective science and the veterinary advocate. I have 2 sides to my brain, and the scientist and the veterinarian in me go back and forth all the time. And certainly as a scientist, I would never indulge in the idea of an anthropomorphic type of essay that I've written about these 2 animals. Well, on the other hand, as a veterinarian, I want to know how these animals are feeling, and I would try and get inside their heads to see what's going on, because veterinarians are trained to be the advocate, the support, and the shepherd for these animals. So in some ways, my excuse is that anthropogenic trauma, such as this entanglement, demands anthropomorphism, because we owe it to these animals to really think about how they're going through the pain and suffering that they are. So here we go. Spring 1993. Life as a young right whale calf consists of sticking close to mom and doing what she says. Sometimes when mom is feeding deeper than I want to dive, I stay near the surface till she comes back up. Suckling is really important to get at all that oil-rich milk. 94 to 2002. I hung out with my mother for about a year. It took a while to learn how to feed on my own once I wasn't getting so much milk. So I lost some weight after I was weaned, but I gradually got the idea of how to swim through the water with my mouth wide open. It's really tiring to swim like that. We have to swim very hard to make progress through the water, and we have to be very picky about where we feed so that we can lay away more energy than we expend in catching the food. Learning to find the best places to eat was tough, but I found that I have an innate sense of where to go, how to find places that we know have been bountiful in years past. I grew in length and width and hung out with other right whales in large groups. One day I realized I was pregnant, so it was time to head south to warmer waters. My first calf was born and it did well. 2004. Once my calf was weaned, I went back to work building up my body condition, hoping to get fat enough to have another calf soon, if I found good food, or some years later if I didn't. One of the things my mother had told me time and time again was to be wary of ships, boats, and fishing gear. The ships were very noisy and confusing because we could hear them for hours and hours as they got closer. and we got to the point where we simply ignored them. Then usually as they went by, the noise, sorry, I lost my place here. The noise slowly faded away again. But sometimes as it got louder and louder, the noise dropped off abruptly, which was a great but deceptive relief. My mother had explained that it meant that the bow of the ship was shielding the noise from the propeller and the engine, which were at the back of the ship. Her advice was to dive as fast as possible to avoid being hit. My mother also warned me about rope. Fishing boats had all kinds of different ropes and nets. The ones that dragged nets weren't a major threat to us, but they did a number on the fish-eating whales and dolphins. The biggest issue for us was rope that went from the surface of the ocean to the bottom, where it was attached to one or more wire mesh cages containing crabs and lobsters. We also had to watch out for long curtains of nets stretched along the bottom with weights to keep them in place and floats to keep the net standing up in the water. When I was a calf, I used to try and play with ropes, and I would get a serious telling off from my mother. But once I was weaned, I found it really hard to miss the ropes when I was so intent on finding the best food patch and sticking with it, twisting and turning all the while. Often I would brush against a rope running from the bottom to the surface. Usually it would just glide by, but sometimes I would get hooked up in it. I learned to stop and back off, although the temptation to twist and turn and thrash was sometimes irresistible. I picked up a few minor scars. When it happened, my calf had been weaned for less than a year, so I was still skinny and hungry all the time. I had found a really good patch of food, and I can't say where I was, but I ran into some fairly light line, and before I knew it, I was tangled up. I had it in my mouth over my blowhole and tightly wrapped around my left flipper. I'm ashamed to say that I panicked. I twisted, turned, rolled, thrashed, and charged around like a crazy whale. I was able to get the trap hooked on a rock and broke that off, but I was still left with an ugly mess of rope. I could feel all the knots and twists. Every time I swam, I felt stabbing pain, especially around my left flipper. I could see the rope cutting into the flesh, and eventually I felt it start to cut into the bone. My left blowhole was becoming increasingly useless. I carried that rope around for weeks and months. January 2005. My left flipper felt like it was dead. Lice had spread out around my blowhole and left flipper. I was losing all that beautiful fat I'd been laying down for my next calf. I felt desperate. The last thing I remember was heading south to warmer water as I was getting really cold with no fat between the water and myself. So how does that translate into where we are now with the species of the North Atlantic right whale? And this graph here, you can see, is the number of whales that we reckon are alive since 1990. As you can see, we did pretty well. Well, not really. It was growing at around 2 or 3% maximum. These should be growing, if they weren't being affected by human impacts, they'd be growing at more like 7%, like the southern right whales have been doing. But they were growing, and around 2010, people were saying, well, you know, we're getting there, sort of, maybe. And then, as you can see, things dipped down pretty severely, and we've lost about 30% of the population since then, if not more. And this is the number as of 2020. And so 2021 is probably down here somewhere, but we don't know that yet. It may be higher up, but it takes a while to do all the countings, count all the heads, look at the photographs and see who's gone missing, how many animals we found. One of the things that is really disappointing is that we only find about a third of the mortalities. So we have to estimate what the mortalities truly were on the basis of who doesn't show up over a number of years, because if you don't see them for 10 years, you know they're dead. So as I said before, this curve is driven by vessel collisions, fishing gear, entanglement, and fertility. And in this case, infertility. About half the females are not giving birth at all. So that's a sum of feeding success and the negative of sublethal trauma, whether it be entanglement trauma or vessel trauma, or indeed acoustic trauma as well. So what to do? I've got another piece to read here. Over the past millennium, the North Atlantic right whale has only just avoided extinction, first from deliberate hunting and now inadvertently from fish harvesters and mariners. We have reached a tipping point. The right whale species cannot continue to withstand the mortality and morbidity it suffers from fishing gear entanglement and vessel collision. We must also consider what each individual is going through as it struggles with persistent rope entanglement. To solve the problem, we need to have the understanding, commitment, and optimism to carry through with what has to be done. By fundamentally changing fishing and shipping practices, but we also need to make those changes in ways that are sensitive to the lives of the humans that work in vessels at sea and harvest seafood. Both industries have already borne substantial costs in the name of right whale conservation with inadequate results. Right whales are a special example of mammals that have evolved to thrive in an unforgiving environment and are specialized in diverse and remarkable ways to exploit specific aquatic resources and environments. We must be the same. The challenge is to find solutions that are sustainable both for the whales and for the humans dependent upon these marine industries. And later on in the book, in the last chapter, the missing link is consumers who do not know enough to demand a seafood product that is caught in a manner that protects whale populations and shields individual whales from the major animal welfare concern that rope entanglement entails, but also maintains viable and sustainable trap fishing industries. Were we to take the perspective of our grandchildren 50 years into the future, we might respond to our current actions in one of two ways. First, how could they all have been so short-sighted as to demand affordable lobster and crab rolls and cheap shipping of goods from overseas, despite the fact that they knew that the North Atlantic right whale species was heading for extinction? All we have now are the bones of a few skeletons hanging in museums up and down the coast, the East Coast of North America. Or, finally, they all saw that there was a way for whales, fisheries, and ships to coexist. Excuse me a second. It just took some legislative, regulatory, and political honesty and fortitude, enforcement of existing regulations, government investment, compromise, industrial ingenuity, and consumer education. As a scientist, I know that it is beyond urgent that we introduce much more widespread measures to mitigate large whale trauma caused by vessels and fishing gear. As a veterinarian, I see the often long, drawn-out trauma to individual right whales caused by ropes from fishing gear as utterly unacceptable. Do we all have the individual and political will to make it right? Government regulations regarding how many animals can die each year are not being enforced adequately. The balance of political power between the seafood industry and the conservation and animal welfare lobbies is understandably heavily skewed to support the coastal communities that depend on the seafood industry for bringing cash flow to the region. Nonetheless, fishermen have been burdened and fatigued by years of whale conservation-driven mandatory gear modifications, while the problem of whale trauma has continued to get worse. If the government fails to make its regulations work for either the fishing industry or the whales, what can we as individuals do? So, what we have here is the status quo of end lines entangling whales. And here we have where we're headed, in my mind, which is to remove these end lines from the game. So now you've got a vessel acoustically communicating with stowed rope on the bottom, whether it be in a bag or on a spool or in a cage. And when it's time to recover the gear, you hit the button and it comes up, and the traps are retrieved traditionally with the rope pulling it through the hauler and the service and back down. Now, that's all easy to say. It's expensive currently, but it does work. The other challenge is to replace this guy. So the surface marker buoy now has to become an acoustic or a GPS position recorded at the surface when it was deployed. So gear marking is important for both the fishermen and the other fishermen around, but also the draggers who are dragging scallop drags and other bottom drags through this area. They need to know where the traps are so they can avoid hitting them. So this idea of on-demand or ropeless or buoyless fishing is very controversial, subject to substantial amount of experimental work and federal and state regulatory interest, I think it's fair to say. In Canada, they're going to be using acoustic retrieval of snow crab gear next year commercially in areas where others can't do it at all. So it's one more thing to read here. Recently, my colleague Mark Baumgartner and I helped to set up a series of workshops to promote on-demand trap retrieval. The challenges for such technology include making it compatible with a profitable fishery, efficient as well as safe, and able to fulfill the tasks of trap retrieval and location required by all interested stakeholders. One type of system releases a coiled, bagged, or spooled rope from the trap that floats to the surface, allows the trap to be retrieved in the traditional manner with a hydraulic hauler. Another type of system, which raises the traps by inflation of a lift bag, uniquely avoids the need for any retrieval rope at all. However, the industry is heavily, though not entirely, entrenched in current practices, citing unbearable costs, inefficiency, and fishermen's safety as concerns about on-demand technologies. So this is a vessel that works out of Sandwich, doing on-demand fisheries testing. So these are two fisheries engineers with a couple of different on-demand acoustic retrieval systems. And this guy, if you go to bang on his back door, he'll sell you lobster that's been caught ropelessly. So it's doable, and we've been working on this seriously for 3 years now, and every year things change and become more and more practical. So I've had some support from SeaWorld, of all places, to buy on-demand gear, to get it in the hands of fishermen, both inshore and offshore, working with folks at the Northeast Fisheries Science Center and also in other NGOs in the state as well. So I think that the last slide here, in summary, consumers should push their political representatives to demand ethical shipping and fixed fishing gear practices, or the socioeconomic priorities of the communities that rely on those industries and the demand for their products to be as affordable as possible will bring the North Atlantic right whale to extinction in a few decades. My lofty goal is to change our priorities as a society. We have the laws to protect the species, but not yet the will. And I hope that my book will bring some form of change to that situation. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I think you're going to land up, oh, maybe not. So what can you see now?
Just you.
Just me. We can always go back to sharing the screen if we feel like doing that. So how are we doing with, well, first of all, could you hear me and you see the slides and all that? Because I feel like I'm talking into a vacuum with the system the way it is. There we are.
Nope,
so
unclear.
I'm open to questions. We could read some more of the book too, if you'd like that. Here is the book. It's available in hard copy, or Kindle will be available 12th of November, and 12th of November. I have the book plate here. You can see the book plate. As you can see, I signed it myself, Michael J. Moore, his book. It is my book. It's my copy. So
one question I'll ask in relation to the book and the book plate, Michael, is what would you recommend as the best way for people to, if they purchase a copy of the book, getting a signed book plate from you?
Send me an email. It's I'll put it in the chat, but it's mmoore@hui.edu. I'll do it right now.
Fantastic. Thank you. And then for any of our guests that are interested in asking a question, if you just put that down into the chat, that should be available from the Zoom bar that has the video image of Michael.
Do send me a mailing address. Otherwise, don't do much. There we go. Cool.
So I can kick things off. One of the questions that I have, Michael, is there any sort of support mechanism in place? One of the things you mentioned for the remote retrieval gear is that it's expensive, and that the fishermen tend to object, of course, to the added expense that they have on top of probably slim margins already. Is there any sort of mechanism in place that would help them to afford that sort of gear, a loan or over time, or discounted gear or free gear given away?
Yeah, there are a couple of federal programs, and I'm not a specialist in this at all, but there are programs that they're considering as to how to do that, because it's a given in my mind that there's no way that these guys are going to get set up to do this on a broad scale or even on a small scale without federal support to acquire the gear. Now, the gear could well get cheaper. We have this thing called the Ropeless Consortium, where we meet once a year virtually right now to compare notes, see where we've got to in terms of developing all of this and seeing how it goes. And right now, those acoustic units, which you ideally have 2 per trawl, are say $4,000 each. There's a guy in California who's developed a timed release where he'll program it to release the rope to come up when the fisherman expects to come back to the trap, which is obviously a simpler situation, but that is 1/10 the price of the acoustic releases. And he said in the consortium meeting, I asked him straight, when he mentioned that he was working on an acoustic release, well, what's the cost going to be like? He says it'll be the same 1/10, the same price as his acoustic, as his timed release. So if you can do that, and he says early next year, that's going to be a game changer, because suddenly it's hundreds rather than thousands of dollars. And that could, obviously, it's an open market competition and it'll work for some, not for others. But, you know, these technological solutions obviously are more attractive to the higher capital intensive fisheries. So the snow crab fishery, those guys aren't really blinking so much, because if it lets them into areas that are otherwise closed, it's a major competitive advantage to get in there. So it's interesting times, but certainly in this country, there has to be government subsidy to do that. And the feds are obligated to do this in terms of the fact that the rules say that thou shalt not kill more than 0.7 right whales a year. And we're killing more like 20. And some of them in Canada, some are here, but they're all part of the same species. So if we had the political will to obey the law, which we currently don't, this is a solution. But if we don't have the will, then there it is. I mean, if you're a senator from Maine who is listening very closely to her lobster industry, of course, or his or her would, it makes no sense politically, because the pressure is all on the industry. But if there were to be an adequate caucus of folks in Maine or Massachusetts or New England in general that held dear the idea that these products should be harvested in a way that doesn't do what you've seen does happen to these whales, and that was a lot of voters and a lot of seafood consumers, of which there are many of us, potentially enabling a political solution, because it is a political problem in my mind. You know, the fishery managers are stuck in the middle because they have to do what their executive branch tells them to do, and that all boils down to politics, really. So maybe I'm being naive, and maybe it's an impossible thing to have happen. But if it doesn't happen, I don't think there's a chance the species surviving. So it's what our priorities are, really, is the way I look at it. And none of this is meant to be negative towards the industry, because they don't go out there to catch whales. They don't mean to do that. And I thoroughly respect these hardworking guys that, you know, bring in the bacon or bring in the lobster. You know, that's not the issue. It's not their fault. It's the rope is the problem. And if we can get around the rope, it's kind of like oil industry saying, well, you know, we're not going to use wind or solar energy because we don't want to, because we're just fine the way we are. And so to some extent, that entrenchment is part of the problem, but it's driven by, you know, familiarity, culture, custom, and profit. You know, they do well doing what they're doing, and I respect that completely.
Looks like we do have some questions coming in via chat. So one that came in a few minutes ago: when are the right whales back in our area?
That's a great question. They've started looking for them. The Center for Coastal Studies does most of the survey work in Cape Cod Bay and Stellwagen Bank. And they started flying yesterday, and another one tomorrow. No right whales were seen in Stellwagen or Cape Cod Bay. They are south of the islands now. So they've been up, a lot of them have been up in Gulf of St. Lawrence, but also some have been in the Gulf of Maine. There's just a recent voluntary speed reduction 80 miles east of Portland, Maine. Whales were seen this week. Typically recently, right whales congregate very substantially in Cape Cod Bay. We'd expect to see some in February, potentially Christmas, you know, but the big months for right whales in Cape Cod Bay are March and April and into early May. And when they leave is a significant part of when the fishing gets opened up again. Because right now there is a closure of the Massachusetts lobster closure, which includes Cape Cod Bay and also the backside of the Cape and parts of Stellwagen, state and federal waters. And so what the whales do, that question is really important to these lobster fishermen. I mean, there are some folks out of Sandwich and elsewhere that would dearly love to be allowed to use ropeless gear fishing in the area where the whales are, because we can get more than half the species in Cape Cod Bay in April, for instance. There's this sort of sting in the tail where if you're fishing trawls, you still got the ground line, and we don't really understand the extent of which that remains a risk, even though the ground line is sinking now. So that's one of the sort of routines that we haven't really figured out yet. So we'll see how that goes.
Let's see, next question that came along. Is there any viable strategy for preventing ship collisions?
The two traditional methods that have, so Norm's just there, so let him in.
There you go.
The two traditional solutions to that are, one, to try and get the whales and the vessels separated. So in the Bay of Fundy, for instance, there used to be a lot of right whales there. They moved the shipping lanes headed up to St. John refinery up there, 4 miles to the east, and in so doing reduce the vessel strike risk by 80%. That's kind of academic now because the whales don't go there anymore. And this is the problem, is that you're forever chasing your tail in that regard. The other thing is, if you can't move them apart, you slow the ships down. So 10 to 12 knots is less lethal than anything else. The whole business of acoustic deterrence hasn't really worked out at all for whales in terms of ship avoidance. My colleague Dan Zitterbart at Hui has been using infrared thermal cameras on the bridges of ships to detect whales at night, and that works well when it's not too windy or not too bumpy on the ocean. So the idea of using an infrared detection from higher up is something we've also been playing with. But fundamentally, it's a good lookout, and it's not going too fast when we think the whales may be there. But the trouble is, the whales don't read anything we say about them, or the maps that we plot, or the lines that we put on a chart. And so they go where they want to go, where the food is, and that changes. So, as I said earlier, whatever we do has to be broadly based. And the idea of trying to manage by focal hotspot management, I think it's hopeless. And that's what we're currently doing, which is one of the major problems.
Someone else had asked, I had read there were perfected GPS to send signals out miles ahead of a ship to avoid strikes. Have you heard anything about this?
No. I mean, GPS is just a global positioning system, and it's a satellite-based system that tells anybody with a receiver where they are on the ocean. And so the GPS isn't sending out a signal. I mean, sonar could potentially be allowed sending out a ping to detect the presence of a whale ahead of the ship. There's a fundamental problem with that, though, and that is that sonar reflects where you get density differences. So if you've got a swim bladder in a fish, you see the sonar a whole lot better than if you didn't have a swim bladder. So you see the fish with the echo sonar. Same basic principle, sound bouncing off something. For a whale, as they dive, and the swim bladder, they don't have swim bladders, they have lungs, right? So their lungs fill up when they inhale at the surface. But as they dive, the hydrostatic pressure compresses the lungs substantially. So they're not going to be so visible on sonar as they go down. And so sonar hasn't, and I think probably the question probably perfected sonar to send signals out miles ahead. That question makes sense if you change GPS to sonar, but it hasn't proven to be functional. And one of the other problems with using active sonar while you're pinging at marine mammals, some of them get really very upset behaviorally, and they can strand as a result of that. The Navy interaction with a particular kind of whale, the group of beaked whales, which hang out in canyons and shelf break and so on, have been driven ashore and with various fairly serious consequences.
So someone else had asked, are there any other advantages of the on-demand uncoiling device, such as the lines being safer from being caught in the propellers of boats?
Absolutely. And I don't think we know enough to give a complete answer to that. But one of the things that seems to be apparent is that in big gales, storms, hurricanes, traditional end lines tend to have a lot of drag on them because of the wave actions, and that tends to tumble the gear around, and the gear moves quite a bit. And that's a problem. But without the end lines, there's not nearly so much drag, so the gear tends to stay put. And if, on the other hand, the gear does get moved, whether it be by a storm or a dragger pulling it along, with the acoustic pinger on the trap, you can actually range on it and look for it. And this summer, a dragger moved offshore lobster gear 5 miles, and the operator of the gear found the gear. That would never have happened, especially if it had been cut off by a propeller or whatever. But you know, a buoy where you not expect to find it, it's only going to be pure luck if you find it. But there was science involved, in the physics of the acoustics enabled the retrieval of the gear. So there are no ropes to cut, and so the propellers aren't going to be creating ghost gear. So ghost gear being abandoned gear that has got lost for whatever reason, cut by an angry fisherman or by a propeller cut or weather or whatever, or a shark for that matter. But once the gear is down on the bottom, the only way you're going to find it is when a dragger goes through and you pull it up, and draggers pull up abandoned lobster gear on an hourly basis if they're in areas that have been used for lobster fishing or trap fishing in general. So I think there are all kinds of advantages, and you know, one of them being the high liner chaser thing, where if lobsterman A is pulling in a lot of fish, then lobsterman B can say, oh, I know where he's fishing because I can see his traps, so I'll go fish there too. But if only the owner of the acoustic trap and the law enforcement guys know who's fishing where, then that game is up, essentially. I mean, there are various complex details about how to avoid gaming the system with putting in virtual markers where there is no trap to persuade someone else not to go fishing there. But that's all avoidable, and it's just a question of how they engineer the software and the hardware to make it all work right. And those are all questions that have been heated and productive in the last few years that we've been talking about.
Let's see, someone had asked, what is the draw for the whales to come to the Gulf of Maine?
Right, good question. So food, essentially. These animals depend upon copepods, which are little marine bugs, sort of crab-like things, but they're about half the size of a grain of rice. And they're full of oil, so lots of lipid, especially in the intermediate stages. And these animals become aggregated into various densities of patches of copepods, which can be large or small. And what these whales do is they somehow sense where the most nutritious food's going to be, and they swim through that. And it must be a combination of chemical sensing of some kind, but also culture of the animals knowing where to go. And in the Gulf of Maine, in various times, in various places, in various seasons, and various decades, the optimum place to go has changed. So for a long time in August and September, the Bay of Fundy was the place to be. Also south of Cape Sable, Nova Scotia, but also Jeffreys Ledge and coastal waters and Cape Cod Bay in the late winter, early spring. And it depends upon the hydrography, because these animals are plankton, they're drifting, so the tides and the currents and the eddies are all balling them up or letting them go apart. And if you're trying to feed in, it's kind of trying to get to fill the grass bag on your lawnmower. If the lawn's only half an inch thick, half an inch long, you're going to go round and round and round the lawn trying to get enough grass to fill the bag. If, on the other hand, you haven't cut the grass for a month and there's a foot of gap of grass to collect into the bag, then you drive 6 feet through the lawn, or the hayfield as it is, and boom, you fill the bag. So that's what the right whales are looking for. They're looking for a full bag of grass, as it were.
We had another question here. Why did the population of whales start dropping again around 2010? Did people start ignoring policy then?
We've been ignoring policy all along.
Yeah.
No, it was. It's a really interesting question. There was a hydrographic shift in the Gulf of Maine where things got a lot warmer in the early parts of the tens, and so the whales started going around the corner through the Cabot Strait into the Gulf of St. Lawrence. So as I described, we had good collision avoidance, say, set up in the Bay of Fundy for 2003. They moved the shipping lanes and that stopped the vessel strikes there. But the same parameters, the same conservation strategies weren't in place in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and they had some vessel strikes, but also some entanglements in the heavy crab gear. So folks in the Gulf of Maine say, "Oh, that's their problem. It's a Canadian problem. It's not our problem anymore." But, it's not as simple as that, because they do still come through here heavily in spring for the Cape Cod Bay, but they're in and out of the rest of the Gulf of Maine all summer as well. And so it's complicated. It's very complicated.
So one question that I had is, as consumers, you mentioned, writing to leadership, and letting leadership know that there is equal amount of concern on the part of conservationists and people who are concerned for the animals' welfare, and more so than there is from the fishing industry. Are there other pressure points that consumers like us should be able to push on to hopefully get action?
Well, I mean, it sounds trite, but the whole wholesale distribution retail system of seafood, if you ask your server, where does this lobster come from and was it caught rope to sea, he'll look at you blankly and say, what the hell are you talking about? And if that could change, then there could be pressure within the whole marketing process. And right now, I think that's naive to think that it would happen. But ultimately, people understand each of us as a seafood consumer is a contributor to the statistical risk of a whale getting entangled. You or I aren't necessarily going to buy the lobster that entangled the whale, but someone is, and we're all part of that same process. It's called supply and demand. I'm not an economist, but I do understand that if you don't buy something, people don't sell it. And so, I'm not saying do a boycott of lobster. That's ridiculous. But there is a discussion that could be usefully had to, bring a more balanced view to, losing these animals. We don't understand what losing them means. We don't understand what our ecosystem is like now versus what it would have been if we'd had, 100 times more right whales. We don't know how many there should be really, but something, say 100 times bigger. The gardeners of the sea, they take up food from the bottom, they poop at the surface, they fertilize the ocean, the fish food grows better, and so on. It's kind of like wolves in Yellowstone. If you bring them back, things change. And a balanced, diverse ecosystem is a good thing. We know that. And these guys are, part of that. But if they're gone, they're gone.
What percentage of fishing vessels right now are using the ropeless fishing gear?
Very, very small. It has to be a special experimental permit to use it.
Okay.
But that number has probably tripled in the last year, but it's still a very small number.
Mm.
I love this question. Where is whale meat sold in the USA and served? Well, it's never sold in the USA because the only whale fishery in the USA is in Alaska, and it's a native fishery. It's a food fishery, and it's not a commercial fishery. So they share it in their communities, but they don't actually sell it. So if you were to go and have Sunday lunch with a whaler in Barrow or Utqiagvik, you may well be graced with a serving of whale, but that's about it. You can't import it, and so that's the only way that you would get to eat whale meat in this country, as far as I'm aware of.
Michael, are there particular organizations that help to advocate for this sort of technology and push for its use that we could
There are.
contribute to?
Mhm.
There's two in particular locally that I work with both of them in this experiment work we're doing with the government and also with fishermen. One is the Whale Dolphin Conservation. They're based in Plymouth, and also the International Fund for Animal Welfare, and they're based, well, in DC, but they have a large facility in Yarmouth Port as well. So I can give you those two websites here too. And there are many others too, but they're the local ones.
Jean had some follow-on questions to her question about whale meat, saying that it must be in other countries or markets. Consumption of most whale meat must be overseas.
Right. So Japan has a market. Norway has a market. I think Korea does. And Iceland does too, but it's quite often not for human consumption, whether it's fertilizers or pet food or whatever. So although whaling was essentially banned in the International Whaling Commission, I guess in the late 70s, those that were not party to that agreement continued to whale.
All right. Does anyone have any other questions that they want to get into chat in the last minute here? Okay. So Michael, thank you very much for the excellent talk. We'll remind folks that your book is available currently. You said there are copies at the New Bedford Whaling Museum, is that right?
Correct, yeah.
And that the book will be available in wider circulation next week, I believe, is that right?
Yeah, it's 12th of November, Amazon. If you want to buy the ebook, you can get it now from the University of Chicago Press, which was the publisher. It's not a Kindle, but Amazon is selling it as a Kindle as of November 12th. And if you want to be nice reviews will be good.
Excellent. And Jean had one last question. Do you know if the seals are coming back to the Hui Aquarium?
I don't. It's not actually the Hui Aquarium. It belongs to the feds. It's the National Marine Fisheries Service.
Sure.
Aquarium. It's actually the oldest continuously running aquarium in the country.
Wow.
And I used to be quite involved with them down there, but I'm not anymore. And I don't think so. But that's my kind of a guess, but that's my sense.
Got it. All right. Well, again, Michael, thank you very much for the time and the informative talk. And hopefully we see further developments, positive developments for the ropeless gear, next year and in the future, and a rebound of species population.
Yeah, and one thing I should say is that the ropeless central really is a company called EdgeTech in Wareham. Rob Morris is the sales engineer there. Has been very, very busy working with local fishermen. In many ways, the product that they are producing was the concept brought to them by local Cape Cod fishermen, and they've worked back and forth with them. And the stuff that I bought with SeaWorld money has gone back and forth for iterative modifications and enhancements over the last 18 months. It's a very different product than what it was. And there's other companies too. There's a guy out in Bellingham, Washington, that's making a good lift bag type product. Those are the two companies that I've worked with primarily.
Gotcha. Well, I'm glad it's an area of active development and not something that's sort of limping along. It sounds like there's aggressive active iteration of it.
Yeah, and the conversation we had earlier this week on a group call we have every week is, okay, how fast can you ramp up? Can you do 200 a month, or how's it going to go? And so, I mean, we're all having a hard time. We're competing with the Canadians to get the gear to put out with the fishermen. So it's becoming more of greater interest.
Oh, that's great. That's great news. Excellent. All right.
Cool.
Okay.
And so you said you're recording it. Please don't release it, because
Gotcha.
there's copyright issues for the book and so on. So if anybody has screenshots or anything, please keep them to yourselves, because you know, I have a contract that I have to maintain.
Gotcha. All right, that is good to know. So screenshots and things like that, embargo on for right now.
Please. Yeah.
Okay.
And you know, contact me if you want to talk about any of that kind of thing. And we can make it work, but we have to sort of jump through the hoops.
Got it. All right, very good. Okay, well, thank you so much. Thanks for giving up some time on Friday night for all of us.
Oh no, thank you all for being here. You know, there's nothing I like to talk more about than my book. I'm a real book bore at this point. So it's a pleasure for me.
Thank you again. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
All right, good night, everyone.
See you guys.
Thank
Good
you.
night.